Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Loud as a Whisper, which is episode 5 of season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I will cover episode 5 of season 2, Loud as a Whisper. So Loud as a Whisper is the episode in which the Enterprise is sent to pick up a legendary negotiator named Riva and take him on a vital mission to a planet to negotiate a peace between the two factions that have been warring for 15 centuries. They pick up Riva and they find out that he does in fact have a unique form of communicating, that he himself is deaf, which is a hereditary trait that his whole family shared. However, he has a chorus of people that he communicates telepathically with, and these three people speak for him. And they each represent different aspects of his personality. And so they prepare for the mission, which Riva seems very, very confident in that it will be easy to bring peace between these two people. But once he gets there, one of the factions tries to assassinate Riva. Riker saves his life, however Riva's chorus are all killed. So Riva then berates himself and pities himself and says that he failed, and he's dealing with the loss of his chorus, who he considered his friends. And even though Data does learn to communicate using a sign language that Riva knows, he still says that Data would not be sufficient enough to communicate with these warring factions, and so wants to give up. But then Troy convinces him that he should turn his disadvantage into an advantage, so he decides to teach the warring factions his sign language, and in the teaching they will grow closer and learn to appreciate one another. And so the Enterprise leaves Riva to it. So first thing I think I have to mention, and I mentioned this in my season-long reviews that I did, it's just a silly thing, just involves me. In the town that I grew up in, or that I'm currently living in, but also the town I grew up in, and nearby there is or near where I live anyway, there's a road that has a lot of like shopping centers on it, so it's a common road used a lot, Riva Road. and so when I first saw this episode, I used to call Riva Road, and I still got that stuck in my head even every time I watch this episode. I'm like, oh, it's Riva Road. But anyway, that's just having to do with my little hometown. But anyway, this episode's okay. It's not one of the most offensive episodes of season 2, but it's kind of alright, so there's another episode that whenever I think of season 2, that's the first episode that comes to mind. I will get to that, I think next week actually. I will get to that episode. But that's kind of reminds me of how much I don't like season 2 and how bad I think season 2 is. Where this episode is one of the next episode that comes to mind whenever I think of season 2, but this more represents the mediocrity of season 2 rather than the cheesiness or how terrible season 2 is. This is the episode I always think of when I think of how bland season 2 is, because this episode isn't terribly offensive. Like, there's nothing really that bad about it. There's a few things about it I find cheesy, but nothing like that, terrible. But it's more to the fact that I just find it rather boring. And I remember watching this episode when I was a teenager for the first time, thinking, yeah, this is very boring. And there's been a lot of episodes I thought was boring when I was a teenager when I first saw, including The Inner Light, which I had learned to appreciate more once I grew older and matured. But this episode, I still think is just as boring as ever. I guess I can appreciate this episode a little more than I did before, but still, I still stand by the original assessment that this episode's boring. It is okay, I guess. It is interesting, the concept of the chorus and how this deaf person is using telepathy to communicate to his chorus, and then the chorus express his feelings. And I like the scene where he goes to LaForge and they compare his chorus to LaForge's visor, and they both talk about how they wouldn't change who they are because it's a part of what makes them who they are, and they're happy, they like who they are, so they have no problem with being different from the others, and I like that. I think that is definitely very powerful. I didn't realize until very recently, I think this year, or maybe it was last year when I did my season reviews, that the actor who portrays Riva is deaf. I didn't know that. But it actually does make sense. And apparently the actor was one who pushed for Star Trek Next Generation to do something that sort of elevated, focused on the deaf community, or elevated them and humanized them, and which I do think this episode does. And it also apparently was the actor's idea to suggest the ending, which apparently wasn't originally how it was scripted, and he suggested right before they shot the episode that they have the ending where Riva decides to teach the other warring factions sign language, which I think is a nice concept. I don't know how practical it is, but the thing that, speaking of practicality, and again, might be minor nitpicking, but Riva says it may take months and months, maybe even years, to negotiate this peace and teach them the sign language. But he's staying up in a cliff face with just a table and chairs. And by the way, there's no shelter, there's no roof, so if it rains, it's just gonna get rain. And where is he gonna sleep? How is he gonna eat? Will they just hang out on top of the cliff face? I mean, isn't there any kinds of civilizations? Why aren't they doing these negotiations inside? I don't know, because it doesn't look as cool or atmospheric, I guess, but still, it doesn't seem very practical. What if it rains? You tell me it's never going to rain within those 2 months, or get windy or cold, or I don't know. Anyway, yeah, so that's just a bit of nitpicking, I suppose. Now, getting back to Riva when they first meet him, I do like, part of what I like is when, they're introducing the chorus and getting used to who the chorus is and how it works with Riva, and Picard is speaking directly to the chorus, and Riva gets upset and blocks his view, stands right in front of him, and speaks through the chorus by saying, "Speak to me," very loud. And then Picard sort of apologizes. He's like, I was just confused by this unique way of communicating. I did not mean any offense. And from then on out, they did speak directly to Riva whenever they talked to him. And I like Riva's response was good too, because he was like, oh, then none is taken. Then I don't perceive any offense. I thought that was a nice little moment. And I think that's sort of what this actor part of what he was talking about, getting them to respect, deaf people, and so yeah, so that works for me. When I think about it, I think that this is probably a much better representation of disabled people in Star Trek than the episode Melora in DS9 Season 2, which I have more issues with that episode. To me, that does actively bother me. It's more than just boring, which is what this episode is. So I would say that this is the better of the two. I don't know if there's another one I'm forgetting about. I mean, there's, of course, Geordi throughout the entire Next Gen. But yeah. So yes, that was a nice moment. And apparently, I think the woman who plays the lead chorus person is John Delancey's wife. I think I remember reading that somewhere. And the one of the guys, the one who plays like the logic side, the strategic and logic side of Riva, his chorus, that guy's Degra from Enterprise. And now, if you weren't aware of that, I dare you to watch this episode again with knowing that in mind, that that's Degra, because every time he talks, I'm like, shut up, Degra. Don't you have a Xindi weapon to build? Anyway. But it's so weird because Dager was like such a... I think he did a really good job as Dager too, and he was such a distinct... I wouldn't say evil, because he turned out to be actually a good guy, like an understanding, complex character. But he was very sort of forceful, and it's weird he's seeing this, chorus guy just try to speak for Riva, and just like... Finish building your weapon, Degra. Anyway, so let me talk about the other guy, though, the only actor I didn't recognize who plays the cheesy guy, is what I'm saying. Now, this to me gets back to Roddenberry's sort of sexual obsession, the fact that Riva only has 3 chorus members that represent him, so they can't represent every single feeling, like Inside Out or something, where this is anger, this is disgust, this is joy. It has to be boiled down to 3 aspects, and they had one aspect was the logic, which makes sense, and then you had the other main one who ties everything together, and the third aspect was his libido. That's what you're going to focus on, his libido? Now, granted, they actually said his lust, his passion, but that's pretty much the same thing. And they did say, the warrior aspect of him as well, which, funnily enough, never comes into play because he's a peace negotiator. This is my complaint, and this is probably the aspect of the episode that bothered me the most, he has 3 aspects of his personality represented in the way he communicates. There's the logic side, the main side that ties everything together, and the horny side. And that's so out of the 3 aspects, basically 2, because you have one that ties everything together, so they basically split his personality into 2. There's logic and horniness. Feels like they could have broke that down a bit differently, I think. And maybe I'm being unfair by, calling it horniness, but I think the way it's portrayed in the episode, that's basically what it boils down to, because every time this guy talks is when Riva's hitting on Troy, and the way... Like, the actor who plays Riva himself, I don't find particularly cheesy, but the actor who portrays the chorus member who represents the libido, I find extremely cheesy. And so every time... So, towards the end of the episode, after his chorus has died, I don't have any issues with Riva's interactions with Troy. But before then, when we had this chorus guy who was so cheesy, he's like, like every time he talks, it's to hit on Troy. And they do it like blazingly, like in front of the crew, in front of Picard. They even have, to me, it makes it even more obvious that he's being like all suave and cheesy with Troy, just by having that's the only time when that guy talks. It's like, perhaps Picard, you may allow Counselor Troy to escort me to my quarters. In fact, the other 2 chorus members even like say, we're useless in times like these. We'll just fuck off. like, what? He can't speak logically to Troy at all? Anyway. Just the way that they flirted was very sort of... I complained about this in Outrageous Okana. It just seems very cheesy and very TOS-like and very outdated and just like... to me, it just illustrates that, Roddenberry's still in control of TNG at this moment, and he's a freaking horn dog. It just openly bothers me every time that guy speaks. I'm like, and just the way that, Reva's like, he just met her. Like, he just saw Troy like 2 seconds ago, and he goes straight up to her and is like, I gotta tell you my feelings for you and how lovely you are and how I want to spend so much time with you. So you're basing this basically simply off of her looks then, because you just met her 2 seconds ago, and yet you're like coming on to her like super hard out. Anyway, I mean, what it was Reva thinks this is this a diplomatic meeting or a singles bar? I'm sorry. Like an official meeting with like officers and Starfleet officers and diplomat, but whatever. Okay. So that, that part of it really bothered me. But as I said, like later in the episode, after the chorus died, I actually liked Reva. Reva and Troy's interactions was a bit more complex because he wasn't just flat out hitting on her the whole time, and we're speaking more of like. And I actually thought Troy did have a good portrayal in this episode, which is rare because usually they don't write Troy very well. I guess that's a positive of this episode. The way she was sort of not letting him, not feed into his pity party and sort of, giving him the tough love about, how dumb it is for him to just give up. But he did experience a tragedy. Like the 3 people who probably closest to him in his life just got murdered in front of him. So maybe Troy should have been a bit more sensitive to that and kind of a bit more understanding on why he would want to give up and go home. But yeah. Honestly, I thought the episode got better in the second half. The first half, as I said, was just kind of boring. And also, Reva I didn't like the way he was portrayed as very arrogant and overconfident. And this is something I mentioned in my season-long review, is that it feels like the only reason Reva was a good negotiator was because everyone thought of him as a good negotiator. It's like these aliens was like, I want to fuck you, Picard. I don't want to talk to you. Where's Reva? Give me Reva. I want to talk to Reva. And once Reva's there, he didn't really say much. And they were just like, oh, Reva, you're so great. You're so great. We're gonna. So it seems like, and he was like acting all arrogant, like, oh, I can make peace with anyone. I'm so awesome. I'm so great. Everyone will bow before me and be peaceful. And it seems like they're only, like, his actual negotiating tactics, or what he actually says, wasn't really that great. It seemed like it's only because of his great reputation that people were actually listening to him. And his arrogance did, in fact, backfire and got his chorus killed. And so I think that was supposed to be part of the point of the episode, but I think they laid it on too thick and they overdid the point, because I had less sympathy for him for being such an arrogant prick. And also, this is another example of tell not show, where they're telling us repeatedly this is a master great negotiator, he is the ultimate peacemaker, and yet we don't see that. We're not shown that. We're just told that over and over again. What we actually see is like an arrogant asshole who thinks his shit smells like flowers. So I think they kind of failed in that regard. Now, I want to talk about the scene at the start where Worf is like really uneasy and Troy could sense it. I do like they actually use Troy to sense someone's feelings because usually they don't. Where she's like, Worf, you're very anxious, and Worf's like, no, I'm fine, and Troy's like, no, you're not. I can sense this. You don't really feel this anxious, and finally they get it out of him where he's like, oh yeah, Riva helped negotiate the peace between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, and before Riva there was no term for peacemaker. And at first I was very confused by this scene at first, because for the longest time, because of the way Worf was behaving or reacting, I thought that he hated Riva because of this, and which didn't make sense to me, because making peace between the Klingon and Federation, especially him being a part of the Federation, a Starfleet officer, he would see that as a great thing. But I think they were trying to imply that Worf was kind of hero worshipping him and was a bit anxious to be around him, but it didn't seem to be like Michael Dorn didn't seem to play it that way. He seemed more upset. I don't know, so I was a bit confused by that scene. But more to the point, getting into the whole canon thing, this, of course, episode was made before Star Trek VI. Several years before Star Trek VI. So it had yet to be established that peace between the Klingon Empire and the Federation was made back in the original series movies era. And I think so because, Riva's obviously way too young to be around during that era. But this also goes along with Yesterday's Enterprise, which also was written before Star Trek VI, which talked about peace negotiations between the Klingon Empire and the Federation. In fact, the episode focused on an alternate future where those negotiations broke down and a war broke out between the two. So I think with both episodes, the original intention was that peace between the Federation and the Klingon Empire was made sometime after that, yet Star Trek VI retconned that where it happened way before. But I can use some headcanon to actually fit this in, and I think it's not too difficult. So to be clear, it doesn't bother me, because I think you can fit it in by saying that even though the original peace treaty, the Khitomer Accords, was established back in whatever year it was, the Star Trek VI era, whenever that took place, towards the end of the 23rd century. And this takes place in 2360 something, I think. So more than halfway through the 24th century. But anyway, so it's a good 70, 80 years later. Something like that. I don't know. I'm not looking at the exact timeline like I did for my Lower Decks review. But anyway, I can square this because the Khitomer Accords in Star Trek VI was basically just the beginning of the peace process. It's saw sort of a disarmament, a sort of end to hostilities, which is not the same thing as these two superpowers being close allies and working together very closely as they are seen to do in the 24th century. And even then, their alliance is a bit tentative. So it could necessitate more negotiations that could go on for decades, including up to the time of when Riva would be old enough to negotiate, and during the time of Yesterday's Enterprise. So maybe the Federation and Klingon Empire did have a treaty the entire time, but it could have gone back and forth, and if negotiations went terrible, it could have caused a war and changed it so the Klingons went to war with them. After all, what necessitated the whole treaty in the first place was the destruction of practice, which I think 50 years later wouldn't be that big of a factor still. But anyway, so there would need to be more strengthening in negotiations, and so that's why I think it actually fits. Like I think this would fit, that Reva could be someone who negotiated peace between the Federation and Klingon Empire, but it just wasn't the initial peace treaty, because that's Star Trek 6. But anyway, so, oh yeah, I gotta talk about Geordi LaForge, because they have a scene in this episode that seems very out of place and very weird, where Dr. Pulaski tells LaForge that that she can possibly do surgery to give him his natural eyesight back, to sort of regenerate his eyes or whatever, so he has like normal vision. And at first, he was a bit hesitant. And she's like, well, why are you hesitant? You're in constant pain. Why aren't you, I thought you'd be more excited about this. And then proceeds to tell him, oh, there's tons of risks, and we don't know this would work entirely. So you wait. So first you berate him for being hesitant about it, but then you say, oh, there's risks involved. By the way, they never mention what these risks are. And since this is never brought up again, they never will. So we don't know what are those risks? Are the risks that he would be permanently blind and not able to use his visor again, or is death what's the risk? You don't say. But anyway, this storyline is completely dropped, and as we know, this never actually happens. I mean, there was a couple episodes like All Good Things or the movie Insurrection where his natural eyes was regenerated temporarily, but he never actually got his, other than that, he never got his original eyesight back. He got these ocular implants where he it was like his visor, but there were implants instead of that weird thing. Although I can't recall if Picard season 3 implied that he actually had his original eyesight back. If they did, they didn't nail that down too heavily. I assumed it was still his ocular implants, but maybe I'm wrong. I wasn't really paying that much attention to that season. Anyway. So I read just now when researching this episode that scene was supposed to be a part of an original storyline where they did get rid of his visor, where he did get his eyes repaired, which is something that LeVar Burton was pushing for, because for one thing, it was hard to see in that visor, which is ironic. And for another thing, it's he said that he was unable to sort of act with his eyes, which I get from an actor's perspective, and that he really wanted to do that, so he was pushing for Geordi getting his eyes back, and apparently they were going to indulge him, but after this episode, apparently they changed their minds and decided to abandon the storyline, and that's why it's never brought up ever again. And so, as is, this scene seems very sort of, it has nothing to do with the rest of the episode, really. In fact, it kind of contradicts the rest of the episode, which is, sort of celebrating people's differences and being disabled, and not saying that they need to be cured. So, yeah, it seems like a very out of place scene. But it's an abandoned storyline, which there are a lot of abandoned storylines which I get really upset about, that I think actually would have worked way better than what they actually did. This is not one of them. This is one I think deserved to be abandoned. In fact, shouldn't have been brought up in the first place. But anywho, oh yeah, I also didn't talk about those stupid aliens. That this is part of the episode that they just seem like an afterthought, kind of like a plot contrivance. Like they seem really dumb. I'm sorry, almost Pac-Led level dumb. And they're also, I gotta throw out there, they've been at war for 15 centuries. I've talked about this before with Star Trek, and Star Trek does this a lot, not just the original series, Next Gen. DS9 even did it a couple times, probably Voyager 2, where they throw out these large, long numbers that are actually very unrealistic. I mean, but if you think of 15 centuries on Earth, like that had like in present day, like that's a long ass fucking time ago. And to think that these two aliens were at war the entire time, like I like what they're getting at though, that the original where Riva like didn't care what the original sparked the war. Like Data was trying to give this, conference or briefing on what the situation was, and Reaver's like, I don't care. I don't need to hear any of this, because the point is that they've been at war for so long, is that it's become personal and it's become interwoven, and it has more to do with the fact that you're just used to this war. This is brought up in other episodes, like the original series, A Taste of Armageddon. Did a good job of bringing this up, and also Deep Space Nine's Battle Lines. I think also it probably did an even better job of exploring how when you've been at war or at a conflict for a long time, the point becomes the conflict itself, and whatever originally started it doesn't matter anymore. So yeah, I did like that aspect of it, but 15, just stop it with these overestimations. Now granted, this isn't one of the worst ones they did. I think the worst has got to be Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, where the commissioner guy said he'd been chasing this this rebel for 15,000 years, I think he said. Or maybe it was even longer than that. Maybe it was 50,000 years. And I'm like, that's utterly fucking ridiculous. Like, there's no way in hell these two assholes were chasing each other for 50 millennia. That's out freaking outrageous. Like, humanity hasn't even been around that long, or at least Homo sapiens. So, and then, yeah, and of course the other one I like to bring up is Wayun in Deep Space Nine, saying that the Dominion has been around for 20,000 years or something like that. No, they fucking haven't. Just stop it with these long estimates. So in the long scheme of things, this one isn't that bad, but it's still just tone it down. Come on. You can just say, even saying 200, 300 years, that's still a long ass time. That I would buy, but you don't have to say 1,500 years. It's too much. Too much. Anyway. So now I would like to thank all of those that support me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It really helps the channel out, and I am, of course, very humbled by your support and very thankful. So I'd like to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Matty Jester, Joel Laval's, Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. We do have a couple Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, I don't find the concept of the deaf diplomat... Let me start again. I did find the concept of the deaf diplomat with the chorus fascinating, and yet this episode comes across as bland. Part of the issue is, once again, limitations in giving Marita Sirtis characterization and development of Troy on behalf of the writers. This was a definite opportunity to do a lot with her, especially with her status as ship's counselor with respect to diplomacy. Instead, role as a love interest to the guest character, not the other way around. As for the main story, interesting, and I did like the idea of sign language being used as a mode of communication as part of diplomacy at the end. In fact, thinking of all the attempts of conveying disability as theme in Trek and failing miserably, that you have the central character pointing out justified frustration, i.e. Melora, and the loss. Oh, I forgot to mention the loss. That's a very good point, Norman. That's probably the worst example of Star Trek trying to deal with the topic of disabilities. But anyway, this is probably the episode that comes closest to succeeding. Given that, the very tiny aside B story of Geordi insisting he did not want his sight back was probably not even necessary. The theme was clear enough. 7 persons of one's chorus out of 10. I do think they did a good job with Troy towards the end of the episode, like the latter half when she was giving Riva tough love. I think then Marita Sirtis kind of shines as Troy, and as I said, there was a few moments like her pointing out that Worf was feeling anxious and stuff, to where I think they did sort of write Troy correctly. But no, I actually agree that she could have had more of a hand in diplomacy itself rather than simply being a love interest. But yeah, that's Star Trek for you. Anyway, or at least TNG. So next comment is from Brandon Neilhouse, who says, if Riva has been a mediator for so long and is so well known, why does no one in Starfleet know that he cannot communicate verbally? I've got to be honest, I don't like Riva much. He's rude and haughty. Lucky shot by the Solari traitor, vaporizing all 3 members of Riva's chorus at the same time. I mean, what are the chances? Riva's coming on to Troy felt almost predatory to me. I'm pleased that Geordi likes who he is. This episode is painfully earnest and doesn't really hold my interest. 3 Picards yelling at a deaf man out of 10. Yeah, no, that is a very good point. I didn't even actually think of that in those terms, but Picard is like, the scene after Riva loses his chorus and he's all freaking out, and Picard's like, we're all in this, he like grabs him by his like sides of his head, like yelling at him. It's like, we're all in this together. Why are you yelling, Picard? He's deaf. It's not going to help him hear you anymore. Oh, Jesus. Anyway, Brennan also brings up another good point that I was going to mention, I forgot to mention, is another thing that bothered me about Riva was the fact that if he is so well known, if he's such a legend, if he negotiated all these pieces and treaties, and he's like such a well-known legendary figure that everyone thinks is as pure gold and the best gold standard ever, how the hell is Picard and crew not aware of how he communicates, or even the fact that he's deaf? Like, that seems like, if he is that well known, that seems like that fact should also be pretty well known. I mean, if that's how he negotiates his treaty is through the chorus, seems like this would be a well-known fact. So that's a bit stupid as well, but it's for the benefit of the audience, so that you can have a scene of them explaining to the audience of how Riva communicates. And also, the whole Solari traitor vaporizing all 3 members. I mean, he was aiming for Riva, and Riker pushes Riva out of the way, and the 3 of them are standing behind him. But it does seem like that's just one shot. Maybe it should have just killed one of them, not all 3. It seems like the weapons are pretty powerful if they're able to kill 3 people like that in one shot. But the effect on the weapons is something I need to talk about, because this used to be very haunting to me as a kid. When I first saw this, it felt like a very gruesome way to die. Just the way it's portrayed, like you see their skeletons and then they just like disappear, just like they vaporize like the muscle tissue and then the skeletons. I've heard other reviewers sort of make fun of it and say it looked very cheesy, and maybe from a modern perspective it does, but that's when I first saw this in the early 90s as a 12, 13-year-old, it looked horrifying to me. But, that's that's just me. Anyway, my rating for Loud as a Whisper out of 10, I'm going to give this a 6 good. It's an okay episode. I think it leans more towards being a good okay episode rather than a bad okay episode. But it's still, I think it's mediocre is the best way to describe it. Like, I think it leans more good because there are interesting aspects to it. As I said, that's probably the best episode in Star Trek that deals with disabilities. And the way it portrays Riva and his communication and his struggle at the end was very good. And yeah, another thing that's very interesting about this episode I didn't even mention was Data learning the sign language very fast, being able to communicate with Riva. I think that was a really nice touch as well and gave Brent Spiner something to do. And so it does come off as an interesting episode in that regard. But on the other hand, there's too many things that I don't really like. As I said, they don't actively bother me, but it's like, all right, the cheesiness of the way Riva hits on Troy. I think it's a good point Brandon made when he said that it comes off as almost predatory. To me, it's more of just like cheeseball than predatory. But that's just me. It's like, I don't think this should work in a billion trillion years, and Troy should be like, get the hell away from me. But I suppose that's close to being like creepy or whatever. But anyway, so yeah, that bothers me. That cheesy guy that they had, the fact that the one of his 3 people that represents his emotions, all about his libido, was freaking stupid. And that actor they had was so good. Maybe that's outdated 80s-ness. He just looked like greasy 80s hair, whatever. Anyway, so that part is hard to look past. The aliens in this episode barely appear, so it seemed like an afterthought, and they seem dumb. Some other sort of parts of them not knowing that Riva was deaf or how he communicated and but there are other aspects that are decent as well. So which is why I ultimately side with this episode just being okay. Like, it's not terrible. The faults of it don't completely bother me, but I think, and as I said at the top of this video, it's kind of boring actually. Like, I don't think they do enough with it. Riva's arrogance bothered me as well. So ultimately it comes off as an episode that is not that memorable or not that remarkable, but still not bad. Anyway, that is it for my review of Loud as a Whisper. Now, coming up on my channel, if I bring up my schedule here, this Saturday I will be releasing publicly to my channel a Patreon video I did several months ago, a discussion with my sister Alyssa about why Captain Jellicoe, from the episode Chain of Command, why that captain is a bad captain. He is, despite what some people try to say, he's a terrible captain, and me and my sister had this whole discussion, which I'm happy to share with everyone this coming Saturday. Monday will be my review of the Schizoid Man. Let's pronounce it the correct way. And Wednesday I'll be reviewing the episode Unnatural Selection. So that's what's coming up on my channel next. So you can be sure to check it out and check out my many other Star Trek videos and my many other videos and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.